Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, Stability, Transparency, Flexibility, and Employer Ownership. Tristram Hooley, ISE Chief Research Officer, will be hosting today's webinar and discussing the apprenticeship paper we released on Tuesday, along with the challenges ISE members face. And he will also be setting out 10 recommendations to improve the system. My name is Marina. I'm the Communication and Marketing Officer here at the ISE, and I will be facilitating the webinar. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box throughout the presentation. And at the end, we will do a Q&A session with Tristram. That's enough from me. I shall hand you over to Tristram. Over to you, Tristram.
Okay, thanks, Marina. So we're now going to look at the report that we released on Tuesday, which is looking at how we should fix apprenticeships. So this is a report. If you haven't seen it, it's available on our website to download, and hopefully you'll find it interesting to read. But essentially what I'm going to do today is just go through some of the key headlines from the research and just kind of tell you what we found. So the research is based on a series of case studies and interviews. There are 9 that we published. We also spoke to a number of other employers as well who didn't necessarily want to say something in public. And we also drew on existing data that we've collected from other ISE surveys. And what we were really trying to do was to figure out how employers were actually experiencing the current apprenticeship system, to kind of get under its skin a bit more than we've been able to do with some of the stats that we've presented over recent research. So let's start by thinking about what we mean by an apprenticeship. Well, an apprenticeship is a paid job. It combines employment and training in a particular occupation. And in England, and that's an important thing to state, is that this research is focused on England, and there's very different apprenticeship systems in other UK countries. So in terms of the system in England, apprenticeships have to be pursued as part of a paid job. They need to last at least 12 months. They need to allow apprentices to develop substantive new skills, so you can't just do something that you already know how to do. And they should offer apprentices at least 20% of their time in off-the-job training. So our employers were generally really positive about the apprentices that they had appointed, and actually relatively positive about the apprenticeship system, although as we'll see they had a number of problems with it. But if they focused on the apprentice, when I asked them how do you find the actual apprentices themselves, they were always enthusiastic, and they said things like this. So apprentices are enthusiastic and capable, and their fearlessness is amazing. These people are the future of our organisation. So that was one example of the sort of thing that we had. But one thing that they pointed out, and it's, I think, very important for understanding how apprenticeships actually work, is that apprenticeships were not just for young people. They didn't view it as just an entry-level piece of training. They also were very keen on using apprenticeships to help people make career changes. So that might be new hires who they hired perhaps as experienced hires, but were switching from one career to another. But probably more usually that was staff within their own organisation who they were moving from one department to another. And so we found that was a big use, but there were also many employers who used their apprenticeship levy to develop existing staff, so to increase the skill level of existing staff. So apprenticeships were not just for young people, they were not just for entry-level staff, they were a broad range of training and development that could be used by employers for a variety of purposes. So I won't go through this in detail, but what this chart shows is the development of the apprenticeship system over the last few hundred years, in fact. And I think broadly, if we were going to summarize what this actually said, we would say apprenticeships have been around for a long while. Nobody's ever really been entirely happy with them. They keep changing their mind about how to organize them and how best to do it. And really that's been a kind of pattern over the history of apprenticeships, is that there's always a thought that we could do it better, and always a thought that perhaps we need to reorganize it in some way. And so what we've seen is the current system, which really began in sort of 2014, 2015, is the latest of a series of attempts to establish a very effective apprenticeship system in England. So the key person really for the current apprenticeship system is former Chancellor George Osborne, now Evening Standard editor, but before he was an editor of a newspaper, he used to make policy for government, and this was one of, I think, probably one of the most important things that he did, was that he decided in 2015, in response in part to the Richard Review, that they should overhaul the apprenticeship system. And one of the key changes that they made was the introduction of a levy, and the levy was an amount of money that each employer had to pay 0.5% of their overall salary bill. Payroll should be paid for an apprenticeship levy, which they could get back if they spent it on apprenticeships. And the very important statement that he said was that those who good employers, those who took it seriously, would be able to get out more than they put in. And I think that's a really important principle, and one which the employers that I spoke to were very much in agreement with. So how's it been going? Well, one of the things that Osborne announced was that there would be 3 million apprenticeships by 2020. This is how the figures have stacked up. And if you add them all up, it doesn't get us very close to the 3 million. So it looks like the government will miss their target of 3 million. But actually, probably more importantly than that, if we look at the age profile of these different apprenticeships, we can see that it's apprenticeships for young people. So the bottom, the under 19s, have not really grown. And where there has been growth in apprenticeships since the kind of modern apprenticeship system has started, has been really in older learners. So that's from 2011. If we look from 2015 through to 2018, we haven't really seen any increase in the size of the apprenticeship number of people doing apprenticeships. In fact, we've seen something of a decrease after the introduction of the levy. Now, we would expect that to pick up again, but certainly in terms of numbers, this policy has not been an entire success. That's another thing that's important, is that apprenticeships are divided into levels. So we start with level 2, that's equivalent to GCSE, and we go right up to level 7, that's equivalent to a master's degree. And what we can see is that the overwhelming majority of starts on apprenticeships last year were at the lower levels, so level 2 and level 3. And the higher degree level or master's levels of apprenticeship make up a very small proportion. Now, they're relatively more expensive, so they're probably costing a bit more, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But actually, in terms of what apprenticeships are being funded through the apprenticeship levy, they all tend to be at the lower levels. So the employers that we talked to said a number of things about the process of implementing the apprenticeship system, particularly since 2017, when the levy came in. The first thing was that they found it to be not straightforward. It was difficult. They had to change their systems and invest in them, and that they generally were only spending a relatively small fraction of their actual apprenticeship levy. But our employers told us that they were using apprenticeships for a range of purposes and with a variety of different levels of staff. So it's this thing about not just using it for entry-level staff that's important. And in fact, many of our employers were using it with people who already had a degree, so they're previous graduates. They were actually using apprenticeships as part of the skilling up and inducting of those graduates into their firms. Most employers were working with multiple apprenticeship providers, and most had also been involved with the trailblazers, which are the process by which they're able to define the apprenticeship standards that they need for their businesses. So the employers that we talked to were very involved in the apprenticeship system. They were generally quite positive about it, but they hadn't found it straightforward. So we asked them what the key challenges were in one of the surveys that we did. Generally, people said they were increasing their levy spend, but they often weren't recruiting enough apprentices yet. There weren't the right standards, there was a lot of bureaucracy. And so we took these stats and we dug into this a bit more with some of the employers that we talked to. Most of them were really positive about the system in general, but they had particular concerns about funding. They thought that the system wasn't funded appropriately, that the government was trying to save money, it was drawing too much money from employers and not sort of backing that up with its own funding, and then kind of crying poverty. And this had led to a number of issues, particularly around the changing of caps on apprenticeships. They also complained about bureaucracy, particularly the slowness of the creation of standards. And they had various issues related to the delivery of the apprenticeships, particularly around the 20% off the job requirements, which they said were very difficult to operationalize. They also talked a lot about the challenges of perception with apprenticeships and that people often didn't understand apprenticeships very well. So out of this, we defined a number of key principles that employers really wanted to see in the system. The first was stability. They wanted a system that was broadly stable and that we moved away from this situation where we were endlessly changing the apprenticeship system. They also wanted it to be more transparent. They recognized they were paying a lot of money through the levy. They didn't know where it was going. They also weren't sure how lots of decisions were made. They would like to see much more of that. They would like to see more flexibility. Many people in lots of different aspects of the apprenticeship systems complained about the way in which apprenticeships were organized and the lack of flexibility in their organization. They just weren't fitting to business needs often. And then they wanted to see an increase in employer ownership. The government talks about this. Many of its documents talk about the apprenticeship system as being employer owned, but most of the employers I spoke to didn't feel that they genuinely owned the system. They saw it very much as a government system, which they were not able to influence as much as they would have liked. So these were some principles that we used to inform how we would like to see the system develop. And that led us to a series of recommendations, which I'm going to briefly go through with you. The first recommendation was that they would like to see stability in the apprenticeship system and that changes should be limited, gradual, and done with careful employer consultation. The second recommendation was that the levy shouldn't be a payroll tax. Government should really reaffirm this principle that we started with from George Osborne of you get out more than you put in for employers that engage with it, and they should increase transparency in how the apprenticeship pot is managed. So this is the idea that the levy should be used to pay for apprenticeships in their firms and not just be a way that the government extracted taxation from them. The third thing was specifically about the expiry date. So the apprenticeship levy gets lost after two years after you paid it. Many of the employers said that the setup of the system had been difficult. It'd taken them a while to get ready for it, and they were still really scaling up the level of apprenticeships, and that they should have more time. So we would like to see that doubled. And generally, we would like to see levy flexibility increased. Now, there were many suggestions, many useful suggestions that employers made about how that could be increased. Essentially, what could you spend the levy on? What was clear was that the things that the levy could be spent on were not necessarily employers' biggest costs. So they didn't really incentivize engagement with the system, because you would end up spending more than you actually were paying through the levy for money that was outside of the levy. And people talked about the cost of staffing, the infrastructure costs, like having someone who manages your apprenticeship in place. They talked about the cost of travel for apprentices and various other things. And what we're suggesting here is that government should not just make a quick change to that, but should spend time with employers and review the flexibility of funding to make it more possible for employers to spend the whole of their apprenticeship levy on things which are legitimately used for apprenticeship spending. The fifth one, I think, is going to be a difficult one, but it was one that came up very commonly, was that many of the firms that we talk to are working across England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and they would like to be able to join up the apprenticeship systems in these different nations more clearly. One employer talked about how they've got a Bristol office and a Cardiff office, and the people are working between the two, they'd really like to run the apprenticeship program they run across the two systems, but they found it very difficult. So there needs to be an attempt to join these systems up, not to become a single system. People weren't challenging the idea of devolution here, but they were saying there needs to be thought put into how these systems work together. Our sixth recommendation was a very important one, which was that there was a lot of support for the idea of higher and degree level apprenticeships, and some concern that recent policy and debate has started to challenge the idea of funding for higher and degree level apprenticeships, and also to challenge the idea that if you have had a pre-existing qualification, so a degree, for example, you can't then enroll on an apprenticeship at level 6, so at the degree level. This was a problem because employers said they recruit from a wide range of disciplines. Often people don't have the knowledge and expertise, and the whole point of the apprenticeship levy was supposed to be to increase the skill level of employees in the economy. And so if the apprenticeship levy can't do that, if it can no longer help people to upskill their staff into the things that people needed, then it wasn't working. In essence, what we were talking about really was that employers don't care that much about levels, about level 2 to 7 in terms of apprenticeships. What they care about is what the apprenticeship is focused on. And so if somebody has not got the right skills, they would like to be able to use apprenticeships to give them the right skills. There was also lots of problems in the way apprenticeship standards are created and developed. Many employers complained that when they saw a job where they thought an apprenticeship would be ideal, it took them years to get that job, an apprenticeship standard agreed so that they could start moving it forward. There's a real need to increase the speed of standard creation, and also to think about how these standards get developed to deal with changes in the labour market. There was a very important recommendation which many employers made, which was a concern about the way the 20% off the job requirements are managed. Some wanted to see that 20% reduced, or they would like to see it made more flexible. Others were talking more about how it was interpreted, how Ofsted and funding providers interpreted it. And so we've recommended here again that a working group is set up with employers to make some concrete recommendations to make this off-the-job training work more effectively in the real context of business. The ninth recommendation we made really relates back to this idea that apprenticeships are used in a variety of ways by businesses. And it really is a concern that a lot of government rhetoric focuses on the idea of apprenticeship as a youth training route, when in fact we see it used in many, many different ways. And so we think that we should be much more positive about the idea that apprenticeships can be used by everyone. And we finally would like to see apprenticeships promoted through the education system, and that's through the investment in high quality careers education and guidance in schools. So they were our 10 recommendations. Just to finish, I'd like to suggest a few ways that if you like these recommendations, we'd really like you to support the campaign. So you can tweet and comment on social media using the Fix Apprenticeships hashtag. You can also raise awareness of it within your firm, that's really important, or your organisation. Discuss at professional and sector associations, LEPs, any other bodies that you're part of. We'd really like people to be talking about this campaign and trying to build some support for it amongst employers who we think generally will agree with most of the recommendations we've made. Use it to counter other reports that seek to reform the apprenticeship system in unhelpful ways. So we've seen a number of reports that have come out recently that have made much more radical changes or suggestions for changes to the apprenticeship system. We're really trying to oppose those and to say that we should see a gradual but consistent and ongoing evolution of the system in ways that make it more useful for business. We'd love you to pass this to your MP, to write and support the campaign with your MP. And then, of course, we would also like you to get involved in lobbying the new skills minister when they're appointed, assuming that we do have a new skills minister in the next few weeks. If you're interested in getting involved in lobbying, then please do get in touch with me. I'm Tristram at ISE.org.uk, and I'll be able to help you to get more involved in the campaign if you would like to do that. So that's our apprenticeship research and the recommendations that emerge from it. We'd be very happy to take some questions if anybody's got some questions, but otherwise, thank you for listening to this webinar.
Thank you, Tristram. I'm just going to give a couple more minutes to our listeners to type away any questions they have. In the meantime, just a quick reminder that the recorded version of this webinar will be available on the ISE website by the end of this week. And yes, as Tristram has already said, please do support our campaign on social media. And yes, thank you to everybody who have already supported our campaign.
Okay.
I don't think we have any questions. So yeah, just a final thank you to all the employees who have contributed to the paper. And thank you for listening and hope to see you soon.
Great. Thank you.